Thank you. And I wanted to thank Joe, who's not here, who's gone out, for inviting me. I'm relatively new to the country. I'm been here for 2 years as a director of task. And so forgive me if my points are more general than just in Ireland. But I would say that I've gone off track in the same way, which is very convenient because it complements his talk. As director of task, which is in a think tank that tries to link inequality and democracy, when I saw the description for the panel, that's what I wanted to focus on. And I have to admit that I'm an American, I'm an American citizen, but I'm also a British citizen, and I've seen, unfortunately, the consequence of how inequality has led to, as she showed a picture of my president, has led to the rise of the far right and the very leadership that probably will do very little about inequality. So, the description for the panel mentions Davos, and Davos inequality has been an issue at Davos for the past few years, particularly this year. And the media, when they cover Davos, is focusing more and more on how inequality is an issue. Just to give you a quote from this year's, in January, it's hosted in January, from the Washington Post. They quote Scott Minerd, who's the chief investment officer of Guggenheim Partners, and he remarked that, quote, "We're living in a gilded age," and this is obviously a very wealthy man. And he stated that, quote, "I think in America, the aristocrats are out of touch. They don't understand the issues around the common man." The solutions of somebody like Scott Minerd or other executives at Davos is to concentrate not on redistribution, but rather on individual training and thus greater competitiveness in a changing job market, particularly because of automation. So companies, I'm citing American companies like Amazon, Disney, and AT&T, will offer educational support programs which pay for the tuition for employees who want to retrain, particularly in jobs like tech support, nursing, aircraft mechanics that are high in demand. So that's their contribution. We're going to train you so you'll be more competitive to get another job. So the critics, and there are many, respond that this kind of upskilling is a Band-Aid and it's ignoring structural problems, primarily lack of redistribution of income, as we just heard, and mechanisms for ensuring economic security, like owning a house, which is a big issue here in Ireland. One of the most common policy alternatives is called basic income, and it's championed by, if you're following the Democratic Party primaries, there's a candidate named Andrew Yang whose his policy is basic income because of automation. It's also been promoted by British academics and European academics, particularly a guy named Guy Standing, who's a professor in London at, I think, LSE. So basic income, for those of you who don't know, is just basically it's a cash transfer every month to every citizen. It doesn't matter. It's not means tested. You get it. It's a form of economic security, and it has no conditions. Since the financial crisis about a decade ago, the countries with pre-existing levels of inequality have remained the most unequal, and that's predictable. And the countries that had strong welfare systems in place, like in Scandinavia, although there's an exception, have had slower increases in inequality. So I'm just going to give you a few statistics, and then I'll leave that behind. If we look at Ireland in the context of small open economies in the EU, Ireland is actually worse. I'm going to use a measurement called the Gini Coefficient. So if you look at the Gini Coefficient, it's lower in countries like Austria, Belgium, and Denmark, and in Scandinavia, particularly a country like Sweden. So Austria's Gini coefficient over the past decade has been 0.284, which the closer you get to 1, the less inequality you have. Belgium and Denmark have also maintained Gini coefficients under 0.3. Ireland's Gini coefficient has just gone in 2015 under 0.3, but it was 0.308 in 2013. So it's higher than comparable small open economies in the EU. The exception is Sweden, which has the fastest rising rate of inequality in the EU. In 2013, it was 0.268, and by 2016, it was 0.282. So that's not a good thing. But Sweden's had a conservative government for the past 8 years, although that's recently changing. So overall, though, if you look at all of the EU, all 28 or 27 countries, Ireland's about average for inequality. The problem is, and as we've shown in our own research at Task, especially a researcher named Rob Sweeney, this inequality rate is dependent upon cash transfers. And actually, if you look at these small, comparable open economies in the EU, the reason that Ireland is average is because of the level of cash transfers. Ireland's an outlier, even past the UK. So these are particularly to the bottom 40%, and that's what's sustaining the average inequality rate. Now, is that a good strategy? And that's the question to ask. There's another measurement that I'll briefly describe. It's called the Palma Ratio, and that's named after a guy named Gabriel Palma, who's a professor at Cambridge. And he looks at the top 10% income distribution divided by the bottom 40%. Again, Austria, Sweden, and Belgium, they've remained relatively stable. So it's basically it's a ratio of 1. Austria, the top 10%, it basically earns the same amount as the bottom 40%. However, in Ireland, it's decreased slightly again, but it's gone from 1.130 in 2007 to 1.1 in 2016. So it's higher than comparable small open economies. But we'll compartmentalize, we'll put aside the figures, and because these only relate to a specific dimension of inequality, and that's income level. They don't explain why or how the levels exist and the consequences of these levels of inequality for the health of political institutions, working conditions, and social relations. They don't tell us anything about how economic inequality is connected to political inequality, which is what I want to talk about, or anything about the experience itself of differences in income within a workplace or within an association, within a political party, or even within a family. So I actually had the same Oxfam figures, so I will skip those. But I will cite an article by The Economist that asks why you have such pervasive inequality. Basically, why has it led to Trump and why has it led to Boris Johnson? Why isn't anything being done about it? What's going on? And the answer for The Economist was to cite American and French academics. Basically, you have Murdoch and you have Koch, and they're the ones with access to the media, and they give lots of money to think tanks, and they have access to politicians. The figures are pretty stark, even if you will say, okay, that's a general argument, but the figures are stark. There was an academic named Lee Drutman who said that in the U.S., fewer than 30,000 people account for a quarter of all national political donations from individuals and account for 80% of the money raised by political parties. So that's 30,000 people in a country of, 300 million. Julia Cage, who's a French economist, has found a similar trend in France, despite the differences between the two countries. The top 10% of donors gave 68 million euros, or they give 68 million euros annually to political parties, or 2/3 of total annual donations. Cage also calculated that 600 people gave between 3 to 4.5 million euros to Macron's election campaign, or between 40 to 60% of all En Marche funding. Macron, when elected, he then cut taxes on higher income groups. So to counter what is a pernicious relationship between democratic and income inequality, I would suggest that we do need to go away from upskilling. We have to, and not just upskilling, but also basic income. The difficulty with basic income is it's not linked to any kind of policy narrative. We need a policy agenda, I would suggest, that's linked to a progressive narrative that challenges this divisiveness between class, ethnicity, religion, that's deliberately inclusive. So how to go about that? My suggestion is to look at security, because security and identity and income has underpinned far-right politics. And sometimes you will see the counter-movement on the left. But whatever we think of these movements, the insecurity informing both needs to be addressed. So one way I would suggest of thinking about inclusivity is to think of gaining material security through greater access to public services. And I'm going to talk a bit more about my research before I conclude the research at task. But you also have to think about existential security, which is a confidence in one's rights and life opportunities. And by doing that, I would suggest that public services have to be connected to strengthening the concept of public good. Income distribution is linked to better public services, but it's also linked to the concept of public good. So just to cite a few pieces of research at TASK before I conclude. TASK research, since I came a couple of years ago, has consistently found growing anxiety, not just among lower income groups, but across all the way through the top 10%, because of their financial position and because they don't have access to universal public services, especially in health, child care, and education. And I'll give you an example. Last year, we published a report on health inequalities in the EU that came out in November. When it came out, it received media attention, and the media focused particularly on what it called the twilight zone. And it's the population that they don't qualify for a medical card, but they can't pay for GP fees. So it's too expensive for them to buy private insurance. So they're caught in this trap because they can't access free care, but they can't really afford private care. We have another ongoing project on the attitudes of the top 10% towards social solidarity in Ireland, the UK, Spain, and Sweden. And as I suggested before, looking at the Gini Coefficient, Actually, the top 10% in Ireland is the most insecure, and when we look at the European data, it's particularly because of housing costs. And I'll quote somebody who lives here in Donegal. We interviewed her. She earns 100,000 euros a year, and she considers herself privileged. She stated in the interview that, quote, "At the end of the third week of every month, I have nothing left." She and her husband, there's a second income in the family, he earns 46,000 a year. They together pay for a house, a parents' mortgage, childcare, university education, and 2 cars. And her kids are in state schools, and she has free health care for her child that's under 6. She said, quote, "While people might look and say, wow, you're on a great salary, and yes, I'm on a great salary, but I'm exactly the same as everyone else. I have nothing left at the end of the third week of the month." You might say, oh, okay, come on, you're on 150,000 a year, that's crazy. But it's the perception that she is in the same position as everybody else, and she's broke in the third week of the month. That's important, I think, is an important foundation to thinking about a policy alternative. So we found this same kind of anxiety, not just about income, but about working conditions. We did a project on precarious work in Ireland, and we interviewed young men and women under 40 who were had temporary contracts or if and when contracts. And again, the quotes were pretty telling. There was one person who said that she had to choose between medicine and food. She said, I remember feeling I don't have enough money to do me for the next week. I didn't even have 40 euros a week to buy food. It would have had to come down to one or the other, food or inhaler. And there's another woman who spoke directly about her mental health. I had terrible mental health issues, like awful, really bad, and it was all work-related, like very, very bad anxiety. It's the mental health that does it worse, and you're just going to crack a lot of the time, and depression really hits. And you wouldn't expect work to have that effect on you, but it really did, and the stress of not knowing, so not knowing when you're going to work, if you're going to earn enough money to pay rent. All my friends who are precarious, you can see it in their mental health. They have very bad anxiety. A lot of them are exhausted, and depression is a big thing. You can't plan in advance, you can't plan your life, and the worst feeling is knowing that your whole life is in someone's hands or someone's control. So just to conclude, this panel's description asks what the solution is for poverty and insecurity. It wonders if, I'm just reading from the description, quote, it means putting more money back in people's pockets, especially the pockets of those who, quote unquote, get up in the morning. Now, at Task, we've seen that insecurity is pervasive across a range of socioeconomic groups. It's not just people receiving benefits. It's not just lower-income families. It's across, but of course, lower-income families are in a much more precarious position than higher income. What we did find is that there is no desire in all of the work we've done for more cash. Nobody wants more cash. What they do want is better public services. And they want the security that they represent and that families can spend less on basic needs. The top 10% interviewees, actually, none of them have complained about their tax rate in the interviews that we've conducted. They think, okay, the very wealthy can pay more and corporations can potentially pay more. But what we want is that money spent on basic services so we have security, so we don't have to go into debt and we can afford our basic needs are paid for. But beyond that, and I'll conclude here, public services represent state interest and the welfare of citizens and the connection that policymakers or those in power, that what they want between citizens. So the political debates right now, as you can see from Trump, they're very divisive. It's like cosmopolitan elites versus the rest of us, race and ethnicity, class. In Ireland, I'd say, and this is as a relatively, I'm a newcomer, there seems to be more appetite for the state to address inequality so that social and other differences don't grow. If you look beyond public services, public services can offer a togetherness, a collectivity, and a way of diminishing differences. I'd also, just as a last thing, suggest that modes of association to establish like unions and charities, et cetera, that cultivate a common civic consciousness, they're also important. We have one more project that I'll cite, and that's on low-skill work. And we found that unions are not only providing a space for mobilization for worker rights, but they're also providing a space for people to meet each other, for interaction, for sharing common values or cultivating common values. I came from the UK, and I spent a lot of time in the deprived areas that ended up voting Leave. What I found was that social activists and local religious leaders, after austerity, after the budget cuts hit, they were mobilizing to maintain public spaces or to set up social projects. Unfortunately, the most pressing need was hunger. So you saw the dramatic rise of food banks in low-income neighborhoods. So in conclusion, I'd say to answer the question that was asked, We have to move forward, whether from a leftist or center-left or simply centrist perspective, by ensuring that policy is connected to a political narrative that embraces a notion of collectivity, that we are in this together, and stresses that security can only result from this collectivity. Okay. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.